We are here today in Manchester, United Kingdom, with the famous Andrew Sherry. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a year in the making, at least at this point.
Yeah, yes. We're busy people, aren't we?
Yes. So you're the chief scientist at NNL, the National Nuclear Laboratory here in the UK.
That's right.
But before we get into your current work, I would just love to learn about your origin story in the nuclear sector.
Wow. Well, I think you could say I fell into the nuclear industry because when I finished my PhD at university and I was applying for jobs in all sorts of sectors, the first company to offer me a job was the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority. And of course, once I'd seized that job opportunity, I wasn't going to let it go. So I joined UKAEA in 1987.
What were you studying before that?
I was studying metallurgy.
Metallurgy. What is that?
Metallurgy is the study of metals and alloys.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was here at the University of Manchester?
That was at the University of Manchester. And then I did my PhD here at the University of Manchester on aerospace materials.
Okay.
So single crystal turbine blades.
Wow. Turbine blades. That was to lead into the future in the power sector as well.
Well, you never know. You never know. We might need some very high temperature alloys in the future, which we could learn a lot from the aerospace sector.
Yes. And then so you started with the UK Atomic Energy Authority.
I
So that was the old form of the authority? How did that work at the time?
It was. The UKAEA in the 80s was really responsible for developing the UK's future reactor systems. So it was a research organisation.
Wow.
It operated a number of prototype reactors, including sodium-cooled fast reactors and high-temperature gas-cooled reactors, and a whole range. And I was in the materials engineering metallurgy department, and we were actually doing work on pressure vessel steels, and the pressure vessel that's now in Sizewell B. One pressurised water reactor that we operate in the UK.
Yes, you're first of now 3 that might get built?
We hope so.
Yeah.
We hope so.
And it's interesting because the UK has a special nuclear history in that, you know, it really was born at the same time that the US nuclear history was born. Right. You guys were instrumental in helping us develop the bomb.
Yeah,
and developed all of this intellectual nuclear capability during that time period. And then kind of launched your own effort here for commercial nuclear application that did have all of these different types of reactors, just like we did.
I think we're one of the countries that if we could design a new sort of reactor, we'd love to do it. And our history has been one where we've tried different reactor systems.
Yes. Actually
ended up substantially on gas-cooled reactor technology.
Why?
I think because there were some efficiency things in that. At the early stages, the magnox reactors were reactors that weren't just built in the UK, they were around the world as well. But we kind of held on to that technology through into the advanced gas-cooled reactor fleet, while the rest of the world went into light water reactor technology.
Yes.
Apart from Canada, of course, with their CANDU system, heavy water system, we ended up on high-temperature gas-cooled reactor technology for phase 1, for phase 2, Phase 3 was going to be pressurized water reactors.
Oh, so this was there's a plan already established, essentially? At least at some point they started forming a plan?
Yeah, it's really interesting. When you look back into the history, and now you can read the Cabinet Office minutes of these discussions that went on in the late 50s and 60s around how we're going to deliver the electricity that the UK needs. Yeah. And in the early days, they actually defined how many gigawatts of nuclear electricity would they want within the 60s. Wow. And they had a plan for that. And the plan was magnox power stations. Wow. And then phase 2 went to advanced gas-cooled reactors, higher temperatures, different fuel and materials and so on. And then the next phase was going to be pressurized water reactors. And the plan was for a fleet of PWRs, the first of which was at Sizewell B. And that ended up to be the only one that got built, because North Sea gas came on the scene. There was a so-called dash for gas. And in the 80s and early 90s, the UK really lost interest with building nuclear power stations and doing research into advanced nuclear power systems as well.
It's so interesting because, as I've been doing all these interviews, I've been, developing my own theories on, why the industry has gone one way or another. And it always comes back to economics.
Yes.
Everything comes back to economics. Yes. And if you...
And we're there now, actually. It's still economically driven.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. And so we might talk about that later.
Yeah, well, let's get into that. But first, okay, so you're at the UK Atomic Energy Authority.
That's right.
There'd already kind of been establishing this plan to move towards this third phase, which was going to be light water reactor, and so your research was involved in that.
That's right. And so I joined at this moment when the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority had reactors, test reactors, prototype reactors, a large number of sites around the country. It was a large organisation pioneering research, and that's when I joined. And then what happened was, the nuclear vision changed for the country. And so this large research capability in the UKAEA wasn't really needed anymore. And you can actually plot from the mid-80s through the 90s to the early 2000s, the reduction in both people doing R&D in nuclear and also the facilities that closed over that 15-year period.
Why not keep fun? If it's basic research, though, I understand if there's a different energy plan in terms of actually building infrastructure. Why not keep the basic research alive?
It's a great question. And I'd like to think if I was in those shoes there, I would have said this is really important because we've always argued it's important. And it wasn't until the sort of 2005 to 2010 period in the UK where this voice started coming back to say, actually, nuclear power is really important for the future of this country. And in order to have a nuclear power programme, you need to think about future research for next generation reactors, next generation fuels, and so on. And so the tide started to turn at that point in this country. And you found people like the government's chief scientific advisor at the time, John Beddington, and others working together to map out what should be a 21st century nuclear research portfolio. What would that look like for the UK? How would it be funded? And where we are now is we're in the middle of essentially the first phase of a new nuclear R&D programme for the UK. We're about 3 years into a 5-year programme, maybe a little bit further, and it's called the Nuclear Innovation Programme.
So help me define what this programme looks like.
So
what's the vision?
The programme really focuses on what we think are the really key technologies and options for the future of the UK nuclear sector. So it covers some of the sort of nearer term capability, things like advanced manufacturing. It covers some of the medium-term capability, things like advanced fuel technology, particularly around accident-tolerant fuel and that sort of thing. And it also covers future reactor technologies and fuel cycles. So it covers that near term where building today's power stations, as we're doing at Hinkley Point C, the potential for small modular reactors in the next sort of stream of nuclear technology, through to, again, sodium-cooled fast reactors, high-temperature gas-cooled reactors.
It all comes back around.
It all comes back around. But what do we need to do now to maintain those possibilities for the future? And that's what that program's about.
So that's that program. You personally, when you see the challenges that the industry faces, if you were, if you had the magic wand and you could just make people do whatever you want them to do, where would you be investing time and effort in terms of addressing the challenges that the nuclear industry faces?
Well, and it comes back to economics, and this is why
I was trying to lead you there.
Because different countries have different energy policies, but in this country, we're the first country to sign up to this so-called net zero target. Net zero carbon emissions by 2050.
Yeah, I've been hearing about this a lot this week, actually.
I'm sure,
Is this net zero electricity or is this net zero...
Everything.
Everything?
Everything.
Woo!
Everything.
By 2050?
Buildings by 2050.
Aggressive, I like it.
And we're in the middle of a sort of coming up towards a general election. Different parties have got different views on how aggressively to drive that agenda, actually. But let's stick with the 2050, which is now written in UK law.
Yeah.
So we have to find a way to get there. But we have to find a way to get there that's affordable, right? And this is where nuclear faces something of a challenge. Because if you think about what does that mean in terms of electricity needs, there's lots of different scenarios. People have modelled this, perhaps one of the best modelling scenarios was produced by the Committee on Climate Change, who first sort of came up with this net zero is possible and is affordable. They did a report in May this year which said that. And what they said is if we maximise out on our electricity use, not just how we use it today, but for transport, maybe electrify heat, whatever we can. We're probably going to need about twice as much electricity as we have today. There are really three ways you can deliver that electricity with, three major technologies at the moment. One is renewables. I'll come back to that. One is gas technologies with carbon capture and storage. I'll come back to that. And one is nuclear technology. Now, renewables, and particularly offshore wind, has really driven an aggressive cost reduction program over the last few years. To the extent that, 5 years ago or so, it was probably costed about, in UK terms, £150 per megawatt hour. Okay. Hinkley Point C, our one PWR, which will come on stream in about 2025, is about, £92.5 per megawatt hour is the number that's the government has signed up to. Yes. That's fixed, and that's fixed for the next 30 years. Okay. But the latest auction on electricity from offshore renewables that will come on stream in 2025 is now £39.5 per megawatt hour, less than half the cost of nuclear. And they've driven this aggressive cost reduction program by learning by building, so nth of a kind learning, by increasing the scale of the wind turbines and so on. Yes. And they've really ridden this cost reduction, aggressive cost reduction program.
I mean, it's an amazing example to look towards in terms of showing how manufacturing at scale can reduce your capital costs.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we all know that any intermittent power source has a problem when it starts to saturate the grid as well. And just like if I buy an apple for $1 or pound here, let's say I buy an apple for £1, but I only eat half of an apple, while it might have only cost me £1, the price of that apple became £2.
You're absolutely right. And so when you then you sort of model and you go, okay, with twice the amount of electricity in 2050 as we have today, if we were to max out on renewables, and the Committee on Climate Change have suggested 60% of that could be renewables, but of course some of that is intermittent, as you rightly point out. The rest they're pointing out would be a little bit of nuclear, in fact less nuclear than we've got today is their suggestion, and the rest is gas with carbon capture and storage, right? With some overlap to balance the intermittency. Now, my view is that's quite a risky strategy.
I mean, have they even demonstrated carbon capture and storage at scale?
Carbon capture hasn't been demonstrated at scale.
And yet it's in the plan?
It's in the plan.
How is that possible?
Demonstrating it technically is one thing. Demonstrating it in a cost-effective manner is another thing. But then you think about nuclear and you go, well, if nuclear is going to play into that future, and our view is at least half of that balance should be nuclear power, to mitigate any risk, actually. But to do it affordably, we have to take a different approach in the UK.
Yes.
Firstly, we have to think about the system. We don't just think about, is it offshore wind or is it nuclear or is it CCS? You've got to think about the system, the network and the balancing and all of the rest of it. Point number one. Point number two, nuclear has a real opportunity, and most of the scenario planning, because they use today's price on nuclear, are conservative. Yeah. And if the UK can learn from some of the studies that have been done on how to drive out costs from nuclear projects, that is, take a fleet approach, learning from experience, nth of a kind learning, get into advanced manufacturing and modular construction, definitely, the fleet build type approach, then you can start to see that cost of nuclear reduce, because a large part of that cost today is actually the cost of the capital.
Yes.
The largest part of that is the cost of the capital.
Of course, if you're borrowing tens of billions of dollars for 10 years, the interest payments on that are going to double the price.
Exactly. And if you can demonstrate that first plant, the second one you invest in, the risk is less.
Yes.
And actually, even if the capital cost of that plant remains unchanged, you substantially reduce the electricity from the cost of finance and
the best part is
of risk.
It won't remain unchanged. It's going to go down.
It is going to go down. And EDF Energy have got some pretty aggressive targets for if they build the same plant that they're building at Hinkley Point C, at Sizewell C, it will be substantially lower. And if they do another one, substantially lower again. So this fleet build approach is absolutely crucial for the UK.
And what's the role that NNL plays in all of this? Are you guys scientific advisors? Have you guys picked up the research work where the UK Atomic Energy Authority left off? Are you just a technical advisor to the regulator when they need extra guns? Like, what is your role?
Yes, and yes.
Okay. Great.
So NNL is a really interesting organisation, and actually it's one of the things that attracts me to NNL, because I when I joined UKAEA in '87, it was a national laboratory funded by the government. But it went through this transition while I was there, in that it had to become commercial. It had to learn how much things cost. It had to compete for work, and it really transformed over my 17 years or so there. Joining NNL now, which is a modern day national laboratory, it operates commercially, but it doesn't operate like a purely commercial organisation, because we have to think about the UK. We don't just think about ourselves. So we play this sort of twin role in that we do bid for work, we work with regulators, we work with industry, we work internationally. But we also work with government to provide the best advice that we possibly can. And we separate out that advice to government well away from our commercial business. So, the two aren't conflicted at all. Sure. But we always have this sort of, we use the phrase called doing both. We're a commercial organisation, but we operate as a national laboratory. Sure. So any profits we make go back into the organisation, into science and technology, into research, for the future, in core science themes, in innovation programs, and all of that sort of thing. And increasingly, because the government has now increased funding for long-term research in nuclear, big program, nuclear innovation program I mentioned earlier, we're doing a substantial amount of that as well, particularly around fuels and fuel cycle programs.
Yeah, so let's talk about priorities in terms of innovation. Let's say we're both on the same page clearly on economics. If nuclear has a future, it's got to, listen, if climate has a future, it needs nuclear. If nuclear is going to have a future, it needs to reduce costs, period, end of story. How do we think about what are the areas to prioritize in terms of cost reduction? Clearly, we're going to see gains that we don't have to invest in, let's say, as a national lab. We're going to see gains if we just kind of, do what we were talking about before. We replicate, we just continue to build the same thing over and over again. We get some experience, we reduce the cost of capital. Okay, great. That only gets us so far, though. And we want to get much further.
Yes.
Our targets should be, listen, if a coal plant, right? If the capital cost of a giant gigawatt scale coal plant is, let's say, $10 a megawatt hour at the end of the day, and its fuel cost is the remaining $30 a megawatt hour for its 40 megawatt hour LCOE, and the fuel cost of nuclear is negligible, our target should be set at $10 a megawatt hour final cost of electricity, right? We're at 100 now in the US. It should be, it is realistic to assume that we can get to 10 without reinventing the laws of physics.
Sure.
So how do we get from where we are now to that 10 number?
Okay, so this is where we've been leading a bit of a program on, sort of thought leadership in this space, because you're absolutely right. We cannot carry on as we are. If we do, we simply won't build any more nuclear power stations in this country. I think that's, that's clear. So we have to think differently. So one of the things that we've done as NNL, again, playing this national role, thought leadership role, is we brought together a whole range of different sectors to talk about innovation. Yeah. I chaired a roundtable at the Royal Academy of Engineering, really looking at this question.
Sounds prestigious. Royal Academy.
It's a great place to bring people to.
Old leather chairs, libraries.
It's very modern. You'll have to go and see it. Yeah, it's fantastic. But we wanted to do it because we felt it was really important. We wanted to get the best people there and do it in the best possible way. Yeah. So what I did was I got all of my nuclear counterparts, technical leads in nuclear organisations, to come together, but importantly, I brought together technical leads from other industries.
I love it. Love it.
So we had shipbuilding there, we had the space sector there, we had the medical sector there, we had digital, we had a whole range of different sectors. And in the morning, I told all those people from other sectors, you need to disrupt our thinking. Ooh. In fact, I'm calling you disruptors.
Cool.
Because you are here to tell us how to do things.
So what did they say?
Really up for it. So in the morning they came and we had a number of talks all about innovation. How do they innovate? Why do they innovate? What's the benefit of innovation? some examples, and we learned about blockchain technology and food technology. We learned about miniaturization of satellites and satellite swarms.
Yes.
We learned about advanced materials. We learned about modular construction in shipbuilding. We learned about the whole construction sector and how they're transforming their program. And there were 6 things that came out of it, 6 areas to drive down in terms of innovation to drive out cost. The first one, and it's not only this was the one we were interested in because we were all technical people, right?
Yeah, sure.
Was technology.
Okay.
Advanced technology, advanced manufacturing, advanced materials, digital technologies, industry 4.0, artificial intelligence, robotics, all of that sort of stuff absolutely should be focused on driving out cost. But that's only one of the 6.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
Second one, leadership and culture.
Ooh.
Because when you think about it in the nuclear industry, and people have quoted this, Bill Magwood has said, and I love this quote, but I love it and I hate it at the same breath. If you brought back somebody who retired in 1978 to an operating nuclear plant, they could pretty much pick up where they left off.
Yeah.
And for a high-tech industry, that is simply not right.
Yeah.
Take another Bill of Microsoft world, Bill Gates. Okay. He says the great thing about nuclear is they haven't innovated. And now they're ripe to do so.
Right.
And that's his vision. And I like that quote. In fact, I prefer that quote, I think. But it's a real wake-up call. But the people who've worked in the nuclear industry have largely had a career's worth in the nuclear industry. And they don't like change. They like to do what they know, the way they know how to do it. And change is difficult.
This sounds like a hard problem to solve.
It's a cultural
So how
issue.
do you change a culture of a whole industry?
Well, it comes down to leadership.
Right.
It comes down to commitment. It comes down to what I call a relentless nudge in a particular direction.
Who I'm going to make? I know this is only number 2 of 6, but I got to dig into this with you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's say that we identify that the problem is culture and leadership, or one of the problems, or this is an impact area. Let's say everyone acknowledges this. How do you make a leader? How do you make a leader? How do you find a leader? How do you?
There's lots of models, and there's a great book. I think the guy is David Marquet, who wrote a book called Turning the Ship Around. He was a US submarine captain who was put in charge of a submarine, not the one he trained for, but a different one. So he didn't know anything about it, right? And he realised if he was going to change the performance of that boat, it wasn't down to him. It was down to the people who worked for him because they understood the system, they lived in it. And if he could empower them and help them to, not follow him, but to become leaders themselves, actually he could do it. Right. And it's a fantastic read, actually. And I think there's really something in that for us as a sector. There's actually something we're starting to do at NNL, because a lot of how we do things has over the years become complicated and cumbersome and bureaucratic. That all, of course, adds time and adds cost. Now, I don't know the detail of all our processes and procedures, but the people who run them and operate them do. So we've got a bit of an experiment in one of our labs at the moment, which is empowering people who use those processes and procedures to sort of problem solve and to work out, how can I do this more efficiently? How can I take out all of the waste, not reduce standards at all, but deliver that much more efficiently? And I call it simplify and improve. So if we empower people to simplify and improve, that starts to change the culture from one of compliance, I only do as I'm told, to actually, I can take control here and I can actually make a positive difference. Yeah. And that's a journey we're on. And I think that's one aspect of the cultural change we need to go through.
Okay.
But so part of it also is realising. That's the second one.
If you remember all 6, I'm going to be very impressed, by the way. Let's see how this goes.
I'll do my best. The next one is around collaboration. Okay. Because as nuclear companies, we have our supply chains and that's who we collaborate with. But often the innovation is outside of the nuclear sector, right? Yes. So we have to widen our collaborations and think differently about, collaboration models. Yes. And take technology that's been proven outside of nuclear, where appropriate, and bring it into nuclear.
Yes.
Okay. So it's not a case of inventing everything ourselves.
Sure.
Part of the challenge with nuclear companies is they're full of nuclear engineers and nuclear scientists who kind of like to invent things, but actually there's proven technology out there that we need to bring in.
Like digital controls.
Digital control instrumentation is a really interesting one. Yeah, absolutely. The whole data-centric engineering world, the amount of data we gather on our plants but don't use effectively.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's the third one, collaboration. Next one is about risk and program management. How do we manage risk? And what is our risk appetite in the nuclear sector? And how can we do that differently? Okay. So, for example, regulation and innovation. How can we, in a regulated sector, still demonstrate, a certain risk appetite or a target in terms of safety, say, or environmental compliance or security, but do it in a much simpler way? It's a little bit like the complexity of our processes and procedures. How do we simplify it and therefore improve it?
Do we have examples on it?
I'll give you a great one out of the roundtable we did with regulators, cross-sector again.
Ooh.
The Health and Safety Executive, they provide licenses to oil and gas industry, 2 oil refineries, same vintage, same design, 2 different operators. In fact, probably originally designed and built by the same people, I would guess. One, the safety case is multiple volumes, 15, 20 volumes, right, for the safety case. For the other, both safe, both licensable, 1 volume.
What accounts for that difference?
I think it's efficiency in how they deliver it. It's about leadership. It's about being strategic in how you demonstrate safety and not simply adding layer upon layer upon layer, but stepping back and thinking, what are the fundamental principles here?
Yes.
And how can we do this simply?
Yes.
And effectively?
I mean, do you think, and we'll get to 5, I'm very impressed already, we'll get to 5 and 6 in a second, but I mean, so far, just connecting some of the dots and some of the things that you brought up already, I mean, is that possible to just take that example of the 2 stacks of volumes, bring it to the nuclear regulator and say...
They were there in the room. So we're working with the regulators on this agenda now.
And will they, in fact, adopt that into their daily practices?
So this is it's a really interesting point, because people point at the regulator and say, will they allow this? I think there's probably a more important thing is, will industry adopt it? Because at the end of the day, industry is the duty holder. Industry has to write the safety case, own the safety case, believe in it.
Yeah.
And the regulator, regulates that, but doesn't take ownership. So there's a challenge around the regulator and industry, and I'll call it cooperation, cooperating together. And our Office for Nuclear Regulation published something called Enabling Regulation, which was really about how can the regulator help industry, but not take responsibility for demonstrating safety efficiently.
How come, and I'm going to be a little bit provocative here, but how come after Fukushima, when we saw the worst possible scenario for a light water reactor happen, 3 core meltdowns, and still not enough radiation was released into the environment to hurt anybody, how come that wasn't the safety case that industry brought to the regulator? Why wasn't it a year after Fukushima, when we looked at everything, looked at all the data, took all the radiation measurements, industry didn't march into the regulator's office and say, my new safety case is that it is impossible, even for a light water reactor meltdown, to cause public harm. That's our safety case.
Well, it's a great challenge. Different countries have different approaches, different cultures in different countries have different approaches. And, I wouldn't want to point the finger at anybody in that sort of situation.
Do you think that's possible, though? I mean, given kind of your background, experience, understanding of the industry, do you think it is possible for industry to take that to the regulator and say, listen, all of these years we thought that a light water reactor meltdown would be a great hazard to the public. We thought it for these reasons. We thought it because of, we were extrapolating off of Chernobyl. But now that we actually look at how these things play out, we realize that the source term release into the environment just isn't that great.
Well, I think the safety case should actually demonstrate that already. And you raise a really interesting question, which is, the regulator in one sense is there acting on behalf of the public. I mean, the regulator is in a sense, there to protect the public, from any, accidents or issue in any industry, they act on that behalf. That's why it's important. They're independent and trusted by the public, and that's why, the Office for Nuclear Regulation is so open, and transparent. That's something that came in following Fukushima, actually, this principle of openness and transparency.
Yeah, I love it.
But with the nuclear industry, as you'll know, the public, I'll use a general term, have a particular perception. And we've done a lot of work, actually, as the National Lab, in how do we talk about risk associated with nuclear power stations or radioactive waste and so on, with local populations, with the public who who might need nuclear energy one day, in parts of the country that don't have power stations. And it's a very challenging issue.
I know this isn't going to sound nice, but is it possible that the very act of talking about risk with the public makes them feel more afraid?
Yes, you're probably right. I mean, airlines don't talk about, if you fly with us, we're the safest airline, and if you crash, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Although cars do, interestingly enough, all the safety features in cars have been a selling point in the past. But it's a challenging, it's a challenging area. but that whole thing about risk management is an area for innovation.
Yes. Okay. 5 and 6.
5 and 6. Right. Okay. So the next one is commercial models and financing.
Ooh. Okay.
These power plant.
Oh yeah, innovation outside of the technology realm. There's plenty of innovation in the business world.
Exactly. How do we finance these big, long-term build programs in a different way? Mm-hmm. And again, government have done a lot of work looking at different funding models for nuclear, and there's a new model out there which I wouldn't pretend to understand called the RAB model, which is different from the the model that's been used to fund Hinkley Point C. Interestingly enough, we ran as part of our cross-sector roundtable stuff, did a workshop with a load of investors and bankers and pension fund holders.
You guys are
about, we thought let's talk to other people about funding nuclear. What do they think about it? Yeah. You know what the first line was from a banker? Why are we even here?
Oh, shit.
Right? Why are we even here? That's the perspective. And then they said, we don't like that, those large nuclear plants, they're too expensive. There's other things we can invest in that will give us greater returns, less risk, faster, right? So why would we invest in that? But this new nuclear, these small modular reactors, we quite like the sound of that.
Yeah.
Because they're cheaper, they're fast, So you can see in terms of innovation in financing, it's not just the financing model, it's what you're financing in. Yes. And that's one of the reasons why SMRs are quite interesting.
Yes, very interesting, because there's almost now an iterative process in innovation and design now between the financing aspect and the technology aspect, where those two have to go back and forth, look at how they might affect, how they might open up doors for each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Number 6.
Number 6, enabling regulation.
Ooh.
The regulator is an enabler to all of the above.
Yeah.
And has to be involved.
Yeah.
And that's why we did another roundtable with regulators of high hazard sectors to think about what are the principles by which in the nuclear world we can learn from other sectors.
What are some of those principles?
Okay, so the first one for the regulator, let me start with industry first. So the first one for industry, it's all about performance. You have to agree your performance standards and you have to demonstrate them. Second principle, effectively and efficiently. That's that point we were talking about, multiple volumes for a safety case or one. Third principle for industry is you have to drive innovation. You have to test and trial innovation in a safe space. Yeah. Just the 3 principles for industry. So performance, being efficient in how you deliver it, and driving innovation as hard as you can. For the regulator, first principle is you have a duty for growth. The regulator isn't there to shut industry down. The regulator there is actually there to enable industry to do what it needs to do, but to do it safely, securely, and to comply with environmental regulations.
Is this written into UK law? This one that's having
duty for growth.
Duty for growth.
Well, it's a good question. I don't know whether it's written in law for all regulators, but it's certainly a principle.
Because this is
recognised.
It's so funny you mention this, because this is one of the things that I think has really hurt the U.S. nuclear industry. When you look to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, listen, these guys are responsible for the safety of every American when they eat and take medicine, right? I mean, that's a big safety bar to meet. They have a dual mandate written into their charter by Congress that says they are both there to provide safety to the public, but also to enable economic growth. Okay?
Yeah.
The nuclear charter, for the nuclear regulator, doesn't have that.
Interesting.
Which means that, and this is a real dilemma for me to even think about, because if I am a regulator in the US and I am doing my duty to just follow the charter and nothing else, what Congress appointed me to do, the absolute safest thing that I could possibly do is shut down every nuclear plant, right? Because everything is accident. I could fall down some steps in the nuclear plant, something not even nuclear related. But that wouldn't be the net safest thing for humanity or for the public or for society. That would make their lives far worse. It would make them far more dangerous because of the alternatives people would be driven into.
That's right.
But if they are following the letter of the law, if they're following the mandate set by Congress, they got a real dilemma on their hands. And I think that's what's shaped a lot of the U.S. nuclear regulatory culture.
Yes, yeah. Well, the UK regulatory approach is different from the US.
Yes, tell us about it.
We're not compliance, based. The regulator doesn't write the rules for us to follow. It writes principles, and then it's up to industry to demonstrate against those principles. And that's the sort of second point about what does the regulator need to do. It's there to look at the outputs, the outcomes, the performance outcomes, not to get into driving a compliance-based approach.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the third thing for the regulator, and this is something we got from the Civil Aviation Authority, and it's their equivalent of enabling regulation. And they call about FAIR regulation, an acronym FAIR, F-A-I-R, which stands for facilitate, advise, influence, and then regulate. So the point
facilitates
being,
first.
Well, exactly. Before you come to regulate, there's a load of stuff as a regulator you can do with industry without that regulatory capture point and taking ownership of a safety case, which they must never do, but to help shape how industry delivers, and demonstrates safety.
Wow.
And then there were actually another set of principles around how do you cooperate with government. And that was around things like skills development and policy and those sorts of things. But these principles, all regulators and all industries of high hazard sectors around that table we had, all signed up and agreed to those. Wow. So now we're thinking, how do we actually work this stuff out in practice?
Okay, because it's one. Beat me to my next question.
Well, it's still a work in progress, right? Because actually it's not just here's the blueprint.
Yeah.
For solution, but it's these the areas that you really have to think about, as industry, as regulators, if we're going to change the way that nuclear energy, delivers low carbon, electricity or heat or hydrogen into our economy, these are the issues we have to address, because at the moment we've got a massive opportunity in the UK, but we're just too expensive.
So do you get pushback on these 6 principles that you've identified as you bring this to industry stakeholders? No. Because I'm thinking if we really followed these, and they all make sense to me, good job, well articulated, this should enable a commercial sector where you've got 20 different companies that now if everyone agrees to these 6 paradigms, I should see 20 different companies get into the nuclear space and be competing to deploy nuclear power and drive the price down to become the most competitive energy source that the world has ever seen. But we don't see that quite yet.
Well, I think we do in other sectors. And the one sector that I've been fascinated about is the space sector.
Okay.
Look what's happened in the US. In the space sector. Look how that has transformed. Where, you have a space industry, world-renowned, in NASA. Things have become increasingly expensive, increasingly bureaucratic and so on. All of a sudden, in come disruptors who believe passionately in the future of space and commit large sums of personal wealth to actually deliver a new space industry in a new way. And when you look at Elon Musk, who realized that the capital cost of a rocket launch was about 3 or 5% of the total cost.
Right.
If I can, what did he say? If I can take those atoms and get clever about how I put them together into a rocket, even if I just halve the cost, I'm making profit.
It's a great example and it makes perfect sense. But I know from, I used to run an aerospace company, and I know from experience that in order to do engineering efficiently, not like, NASA and said contractors did it, but to do it like the commercial industry, the way that you engineer, the way that you design different components is you test them to failure. You understand what the failure point is, and then you define your engineering criteria based off of that. Okay, and Elon Musk did this. He blew up rockets, and he's even famous for saying after a test went perfectly, now blow that thing up, even though it's going to cost them tens of millions of dollars to rebuild it. He said, I want to know where that thing fails. We don't allow that in the nuclear sector, even though there's no good reason why we shouldn't be able to cordon off an area of land or dig a hole somewhere, line it with steel or something, and allow people to test reactors to failure.
Think about what that third principle for industry I said was, which was drive innovation and test it in a safe space. Government have published a white paper on innovation and regulation, and one of the things that they've learned from other sectors, and I hate this phrase because it's like management speak, they talk about sand pits.
Yeah.
Sand pits are safe spaces where you can trial innovation.
Well, you sit sandboxes and coding with the same thing.
Exactly. You know, these come from the finance sector. But that principle is really important. You know, where we need to, and actually, you know, the other thing is, you know, modelling and simulation is so much more advanced now than it used to be. There are probably tests that we do now that we probably don't need to do because you can simulate it. But we have to find a way to demonstrate technology, and if we need to go to failure, find a way to do it in a safe space, as they've done in the space sector.
Do you think that's possible? Do you think we could build a literal physical sandbox to test nuclear reactors? Dig a hole in a mountain and then invite innovators to come in and say, listen, one at a time, go in, blow your thing up?
Well, I think that might be a stretch, whole reactors. But to test certain things.
But to me, it's so critical. From having designed physical, mechanical systems, it is so critical to physically test them.
Well, I think a lot of the physical tests have been done, actually. A lot of the history in the nuclear industry is around exactly those sorts of tests, when they were a lot easier to do in the past. You know, dropping whole fuel bundles and melting fuel into corium and seeing what happens to it and all that sort of stuff. So actually, one of the things we can do, and this is where digital technologies come in, is can't we mine, you know, the history and of all the experimental work that's been done in the past.
Yes.
And you know, as NNL, we sit on a whole host of historical data and information from the days when I joined UKAEA and before, when, you know, we were doing that sort of stuff. And we should bring it forward. But equally, I think we can design modern experiments to test, you know, maybe not a whole reactor, but fuel, you know, different aspects of the reactor technology. And at the end of the day, it's to give us the confidence that what we're doing, we can do safely. And actually, you know, and the regulator role to judge that on behalf of the public as experts, you know, to give a, you know, a tick in the box where that's the case.
Yeah.
And we have to think in those terms. We have to.
Yes. Okay. I mean, listen, this has just been a wealth of information so far. I'm going to have to actually sit back, re-listen to this episode 5 times and process all of this again. But I would like to ask you to, you know, paint your vision for the future. If we follow these paradigms, you know, what have you seen, you know, just through interacting with the industry, if you were to extrapolate that into the most optimistic scenario, because we always like to end on another optimism, where can we be 10 years from now?
Well, you know, if I look at the UK, you know, first of all, I think the opportunity for nuclear is to deliver, and we have about 10 gigawatts of nuclear power today. In 10 years, we'll hardly have any, because it will all be shut down. Hinkley Point C will come online, and that'll give us a little bit more. But the opportunity, going back to where we started, doubling the electricity needs in the UK, we need nuclear for electricity, for heat, and for hydrogen generation. We talk in round terms of around 50 gigawatts by 2050, 50 by 50. And that's in 3 streams of nuclear technology. Large nuclear, like Hinkley Point C, let's have a fleet, you know, approach to that. I think small modular reactors are absolutely fascinating, not just for the financing opportunity, the innovation in modular construction and so on, but also the distributed nature of them around the country, and the export opportunity. You know, let's not forget about other parts of the world that really need low carbon electricity. There's a massive export opportunity for these things, and I think we've got the opportunity to demonstrate them here. But then going back to some of those earlier, you know, advanced reactor systems that can deliver high grade heat for industry, you know, can deliver hydrogen, you know, for a future hydrogen economy, and so on. So I talk about, in fact, I should talk about 4 streams actually. You know, those 3 streams I've talked about: large nuclear, small modular, and advanced modular reactor technology. But then we've got fusion as well. Massive engineering challenges, absolutely understand that, but we should pioneer that research as well. And at the same time of all of that, we have to deal with the legacy and the environmental consequences of that.
Andrew,
so there's plenty to do.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.